All right, it's 7:03, so I think we'll get going. Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's OFAH Inside Access webinar. My name is Kirsten Snoek, and I am the wildlife biologist here at the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. I'll be your host for the evening as we learn from MNRF staff about moose aerial surveys and their important role in moose management, and then later briefly getting into the 2022 tag allocation results and how moose hunters can use that information when planning this year's moose hunting season. In presenting this webinar, the OFAH is continuing our efforts to bring our members valuable information and resources so they can get the most out of their hunting experiences. Before we get going, there are the usual housekeeping items to go through. Tonight's focus is on the MNRF moose aerial surveys. We recognize many of you may have questions about the still relatively new points-based moose tag system. If you would like a more in-depth discussion on this topic, we did do a previous Inside Access webinar on this last year, and the recording of that can be found on the OFAH YouTube channel. Please be sure to check that out if you're interested. That brings me to my next point, which is to say that this event will also be recorded and will be available on our YouTube page in the coming days. All those who registered for this event will receive an email notifying you when the video is available. So if you couldn't make it tonight or you can't stay for the entirety of tonight's presentation, don't worry. You can watch this later when you're able to do so. You'll notice that your video and mics are turned off. This is to help keep the event running smoothly, as there are many of you on the call right now, which is great to see, lots of interest. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to send in your questions and comments. Mark Rickman, our policy manager, is behind the scenes and will be monitoring the questions coming in throughout the evening so that we can answer as many as we can tonight. Having said all that, we anticipate about an hour-long presentation followed by a Q&A session with room to go over that if needed. If there are some outstanding questions, myself, Mark, and other OFAH staff will follow up with you after the event if necessary. Again, please use the Q&A function to send in those questions. We also received some questions in advance, so I'll be interjecting at times throughout the presentation to ask those questions as well. I think that just about covers things. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Philip DeWitt, Provincial Wildlife Monitoring Program Leader with the MNRF, and Patrick Hubert, who is the MNRF Senior Wildlife Policy Advisor. Welcome, guys. I'll let you take things from here.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, good morning. Good morning. Nope, already off to a good start. Good evening, and thanks for the opportunity to come. Obviously, I'll be talking here about moose aerial inventories and just kind of walking through the life cycle with it. And I've been looking forward to this opportunity to present this information and answer some questions related to it. So I'm just going to jump right into it, and I'll kind of go from the start here. So before getting into the life cycle, I always kind of like to kind of set a little bit of the stage, and just so that way we all have kind of a common understanding of what I'm talking about moose aerial inventories, like what we're talking about, some of the history and the context behind it. So the province of Ontario has been monitoring moose populations using a standardized plot survey for many decades. Some of the early work was actually done in the early to mid 1970s. And then was kind of standardized under a provincial sort of approach in about the 80s. And so for this over 40 years, the province has been conducting these moose aerial inventories every single winter. And the current methods that we're using were developed from statistical theory generated in Alaska here in 1986. And some of you may be aware here of the kind of the gas-away method. So we are really relying on kind of those principles that came out of Alaska for a lot of the moose monitoring that we do here in Ontario. So really with moose aerial inventories, there's kind of these primary goals. At the end of the day, our intent with moose monitoring is to be able to estimate the moose population abundance, information about the demography, such as sex ratios, as well as calf recruitment, so how many calves have made it into winter. And then collectively from this information also have information of the trends over time. So trends in the overall population abundance, calf recruitment, and sex ratios all together. These data that we collect then really kind of support multiple functions for the ministry. Here on the left, so kind of at the broadest level, we have a survey management, so kind of this overarching policy that looks at the province's goals as it relates to moose, elk, caribou, and white-tailed deer, and just kind of setting, kind of our expectations for how we're going to manage these 4 species. In addition to that, then kind of within the framework of survey management, moose aerial inventories, of course, inform directly harvest planning. So some of the stuff that Patrick will be talking about here later today. And this will be, how most hunters are kind of familiar with moose aerial inventories, is kind of through that harvest planning process and then resulting tag allocations. That said, the data that we collect also informs habitat management directly through forest policies. So here on the example to the right, depending which part of the province you're in, forest management policy, there's a series of documents that kind of lay out some of the rule sets and expectations around forest management, both at the landscape level, so kind of the big picture, and then also kind of on a more fine scale as well. And so the information that we collect through moose aerial inventories, in addition, to that previous slide talking about, say, abundance and trends, also the distribution of moose across the landscape and in relation to habitats. We can use that information to look and see how forest management practices are influencing the distribution of moose, the abundance of moose, and then feed that back into the habitat management policies that the ministry uses in the forested regions. And so, so that kind of, the broad overview. And now thinking about kind of in the temporal span. So this is kind of, I guess, how I've conceptualized the annual cycle for moose aerial inventories. And so if we start kind of, say in April, when we have published moose quotas from the previous years, kind of there's this period here where the moose aerial inventories start again after that work is complete. And what we do is we start to develop a plan and how we're going to be monitoring moose in the coming winter. From that, we step into stratification, planning and training. Then we actually start conducting the moose aerial inventories in winter, and then go through the delivery into the harvest plan itself. And so really kind of the way that I've laid this the slide deck out is just kind of walking through this life cycle. And so wanting to start there at that beginning piece, and then kind of having a bit of an overview and discussion about how do we choose survey areas, how do we stratify plots, and what is entailed here with the planning and the training before we even get to the conducting surveys.
Phil, if I can just interrupt here, actually,
Yeah.
Your mic is just coming in and out a little bit. So just wanted to see if you can.
That's not great.
We're still hearing you, don't worry about it, just coming in and out of it. So just, yeah, maybe speak it just a bit louder.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, so through kind of this next series of slides, then just to kind of reiterate, so really kind of want to step through that process. So talk about, how do we start planning surveys and then get from that plan into kind of this preparation stage before we even hit the field. And then talk about, conducting the surveys, how we convert that into estimates of population size and demography. And then Patrick will take over this last bullet in relation to how that moose aerial inventory data makes its way into the harvest planning process. So just to start here at the beginning then, as I said, kind of here in the June and August, this is when we start developing a survey plan and really looking at survey areas. And so really in the past, there's been a couple of different approaches that we've used. These days, the way that we approach it is really prioritizing surveys based off of the years since the last survey and the distribution of effort across the landscape. And so by looking at years, of course, that's where the most uncertainty really happens with moose population estimates, the longer time between surveys. The more uncertainty we have about what the population is doing, and hence it becomes a little bit more problematic in terms of having concrete expectations about what the population is doing. In addition to that, we have to consider effort across the landscape. Ontario is a really big province, as you're aware, and so what the weather is doing up in the northwest is not necessarily indicative of what's happening in central Ontario. And so by spreading surveys across the province, what we're looking to do is kind of distribute our risk to some extent. And so that way take advantage of changing weather windows and spread our surveys and try and get as much as we can across instead of putting all our eggs in a single basket in one part of the province. Another component we do here is identify contingency surveys. So, we'll have this list of surveys where our primary focus is, but at the same point in time, we'll identify usually a couple of surveys where if for whatever reason, say weather conditions go bad or moose move into late winter habitat where we can't see them, we'll identify a couple of contingency surveys in other areas. So if there's a problem in one part of the province, we can shift that effort to another part of the province. And then, of course, this is all kind of conditional on the resources that we have available. So as part of this planning process, of course, we have these conversations around, identifying what sort of resources this plan will take, assess those needs, and then based off of that, draft up a bit of a survey schedule and how we think we can get that work done relative to kind of the progression of a normal winter and the availability of resources across the province.
Phil, if I can ask here, does hunter interest and hunting effort in a given WMU influence the selection of units at all?
Not at present, no. So in the past, there was some weighting towards areas that had a particular interest or heavier hunting pressure. We ended up stepping away from that model a little bit for two reasons. One, because of that time sense. And so wanting to be able to cover all of the moose core sort of range in Ontario on a regular basis and not foregoing effort on kind of the edges of the range so we can kind of be forward looking as opposed to responsive. And then secondarily as well, just kind of, again, thinking about distributing effort across the landscape as well. So not just focusing,
Sure.
but yeah, again, distributing that effort.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, and so this gets to another point here though too around kind of that repeat. So again, big province, and so in the past as well, both when we kind of targeted surveys on more than the time component. Originally we were looking at getting back to the same survey area once every 3 years across the entire province. And that was a goal we've had since at least the 90s. And it's been challenging to meet and also hasn't been terribly effective in terms of distributing our resources where they're most useful, both for the management of moose, the management of habitat, and as well kind of the hunter interest piece. And so what we've moved to is this model where we have the targeted time between surveys varying depending on a little bit more of the surveyed ecological zones. So if you can picture in your mind for the province, we have surveyed ecological zones A, B, the C's, the D's, and the E's. And each one of those has a kind of a bit more guidance one way or the other in terms of the focus of different surveys. And so here in green, where we're targeting 3 years between surveys, it's kind of what we think of to some extent as like core moose habitat. So, surveyed ecological zones B, C, and D. And so we're trying to get there a little bit more often. And then surveyed ecological zones A, kind of farther to the north, and E, down in the southeast, we put a little bit more time between. And so then what that looked like for this year, and looking at the time since the last survey, and then those priorities, this is the plan that we walked into for this year. And so you can see here in green are the WMUs that were flying this winter. And then again, you can see kind of these contingency surveys. We have one in the northwest, kind of in the Kenora area. Then we have one to the east, kind of in the Temiskaming area. And then again, just kind of, circling back around distributing effort a little bit more widely. So you can see that we've got effort going on in the northwest, the northeast, and kind of south central as well. So taking advantage of, kind of the differing weather patterns, our distribution of helicopters and staff members, and all the time trying to kind of pick up those surveys which are having the longest time in between since the last survey. So once we kind of developed that map, that took us to this area where we're estimating the resource needs. So for any given survey, we have an area we can kind of estimate based off in the past in terms of how many plots we might expect to need to fly to hit our targets. And then from that, we can calculate the number of helicopter days we'd expect and turn that into a tactical plan. So how many flying days and how many aircraft we might expect to deliver that survey. And so this year, looking all across this and thinking about, if we're starting surveys in December and ending them sometime in kind of early to mid-February, based off of this tactical plan, kind of gave us the heads up that we could at some times of the year be requiring up to 15 aircraft at any given time, depending on how the weather is going across the landscape. And so this was kind of, even in there early as September, October, in terms of looking at this, started to have conversations internally with regional operations division and our aviation staff in terms of how we're going to pull this off, in terms of identifying, what our aircraft resources look like, where they need to be distributed, and how we might turn that into an actual operational plan once snow conditions improve. So once we develop that plan, we kind of have everything set up and start having those conversations around resources. Another step that we go into is stratification. I'll try, and this is a little bit technical, but I'll try and kind of get this at a bit of a high level. And so what you'll see here on the right-hand side in a couple of slides is here and farther in, some example data. And all this is showing is kind of these different strata. And so just to kind of start at the basics, stratification, essentially what it is the idea of dividing a survey area into subsets where we independently sample moose. So you could think we have a survey area, we could just survey the entire landscape or the entire area either randomly or systematically. So what stratification does is it essentially lets us focus effort differently across different parts of the landscape. So here, cooler colors like the green might have, for example, higher moose densities, and red might have lower densities. And so in this case, what we do is we'd want to allocate more effort, fly more plots in higher density areas, and spend less time in these low density areas. And so the benefits of stratification is that it really results in a more efficient survey than random sampling. And that just has to do with kind of the statistical properties of, how moose are distributed and how the math works. And one of the benefits of stratification is it's not harmful if there's no true stratification. So in this case, let's say that we've stratified moose density into these three colors. And let's say that moose are just randomly distributed across the entire landscape. If we stratified this, we wouldn't necessarily gain the efficiency of stratification, but at the same point in time, we don't lose anything. All that data still kind of comes in, and it still results in kind of that accurate and precise estimate that we're looking for. So there's a lot of different ways to stratify data. So if we go back to this seminal paper from Alaska, Gasaway identifies kind of 4 different approaches. One is to do kind of a pre-stratification survey. So early on in Alaska, what they ended up doing is they'd use a fixed wing plane to fly over the survey area, use that to identify kind of in general where moose were, and then go in a second time and actually do a more detailed survey. So that approach, is great insofar that it's responsive to what moose are doing within that winter, but also is extremely expensive because you're essentially like taking all your aircraft time, and you may not be doubling, but you're certainly spending a lot more effort than you would using other approaches. Other methods that people use, using historical data in any, there's different ways of doing that, either raw observations, or you can develop models to kind of fill in those unsampled areas. Track abundance, so looking to see where moose tracks are found and stratifying based off of that, or just a purely habitat-based approach as well. So if you have information about how moose distribute themselves in winter based on habitat, then you could use that habitat to kind of partition your effort and stratify. So historically in Ontario, we've kind of used a couple of different approaches. In generally, what we've done is kind of using previous inventories and kind of amalgamated that with, what knowledge biologists have about the distribution of moose, the habitat conditions, and road access. So trying to take all that information and synthesize it to come up with a stratification scheme for that area.
Bill, if I can interject here, that knowledge that you're just talking about there, where does that come from? Is that local? Is that historic? Or where is that knowledge coming from?
Yeah, so historically it was any number of sources. So past aerial survey data, the other work that the ministry actually does on the land related to forest values collection. So flights and data that are collected in response to forest management planning, and just other information, talking with conservation officers that are out on the land, talking with hunters, etc. So that's kind of how historically it's been done. In recent years, we've kind of switched to a standardized stratification method. And so this kind of came around for a couple of different reasons. The different approaches and using kind of that synthesized knowledge was effective. It was also very time consuming. And it was really reliant on the experience of the biologist doing it. And so you can imagine a situation that, as your staff turnovers, sometimes that knowledge may not continue in a location and having to kind of relearn that. And so kind of stepping back from that and looking for opportunities to leverage all the work that's been done in the province previously, and kind of creating a tool that everybody can use. Here in 2019, we adopted this standardized method, and for a couple of years, we actually compared it to that traditional approach just to confirm that it's doing what it should be doing, and indeed it does. And so just quickly to kind of walk through it, here are kind of the steps here on the left-hand side kind of correspond to these graphs on the right-hand side, which are taken from a paper that was published here in 1998 looking at a statistical approach. So essentially what this approach does is it takes this historical moose data, and then it predicts moose densities across the province using those data and this spatial model. So you can kind of see in comparing these density of points observed here and kind of the size of the points, those correspond to these warm and cool colors from this model. And so it gives that expected moose density based off of what's flown. So then taking this continuous model, this expected moose density across the province, we can separate out individual survey areas. So essentially, whatever, say we want to extract WMU 35 or WMU 15A. We can pull that out with that moose density, and then using that the densities in there, we create these three strata: high, medium, and low, just using those densities only within the survey area. And then we finally assign all the plots within the survey area to one of those densities. And then, as I was saying earlier, when it comes to actually operationalizing this, what we end up doing is crews will emphasize monitoring the high stratum plots over the low stratum plots just based off of the statistical reasons. So again, trying to increase the efficiency of a survey by spending more effort in the higher density areas. So that's the stratification part. And so we typically kind of do that there in September and October as we're kind of preparing for some the continued planning and the moose aerial inventory training. So when you think of kind of the pre-survey planning, there's a whole kind of bunch of pieces to this. There's the aviation, and then there's the staff and equipment piece. So on the aviation front, again, we're going back to that original plan and looking at our aircraft availability both in the ministry and then starting to reach out to commercial operations and securing contracts to supplement the work that we may not be able to do just with our aircraft. At the same point in time, before the snow gets too deep, we started to organize fuel caches. So try to identify where we want to put fuel to economize how much time we're spending in the air versus on the ground refueling.
Phil, just while you're on that, just a
Mhm.
quick question on that. In more accessible units, like I assume that it's stored at local airports or somewhere quite accessible, but can you explain the logistics that go into storing that fuel in remote areas?
Yeah, it's really highly variable. So right now, we've kind of, if you cast your mind back to one of those, the earlier slide showing our effort. So kind of west of Thunder Bay, we have some fuel out dropped off kind of between Atikokan and Thunder Bay, out in kind of on a road essentially. And so in some cases where it's, kind of road accessible, what we'll be doing is looking for areas where helicopter can't get into. It's accessible by trucks and a plow kind of early on in the season. Similarly, that's the approach we've kind of taken in some of kind of the more eastern areas as well. There's some of the more remote work, such as WMU 17, 18A, and 18B, where all of our kind of aviation resources tend to be kind of on that southern area. Where we'll actually like take an otter and fly fuel caches into, say, Martin Falls or other areas that are a little bit more centrally located. And so certainly some of those more remote sorts of surveys, such as kind of north of Geraldton, has been the area where, you have to spend a little bit more time and sometimes work with the fire crews in terms of leveraging the fuel that they have. And then sometimes having to just supply just drum fuel to these remote locations. So there's quite a bit of organization on that front as well. Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then at the same time as that is happening, there's kind of the staff and equipment piece. So from those stratification maps, we're developing the survey maps, staff rosters, so starting to look at what staff are available to support the surveys. And look at all the work that they have, how that might fit into the different times and availabilities, and then actually start turning that into a bit of a schedule. At the same point, while we're working on the staffing side of it, folks at regional operations are also looking at the survey equipment, the maps, to make sure that they're both ready and accessible to all the pilots and all the staff members, and then kind of early on in that season as well, start looking at the snow network stations, and ensure that those are set and start to be monitored. And the snow piece becomes really important as we start kind of closing in on the surveys. So really, even a couple of weeks before surveys start, we have a kind of a provincial operations team that consists of myself, a couple of folks with our aviation group, and then representatives from regional operations in all three regions. And we usually meet at least once a week to kind of discuss, what survey conditions are looking like across the province, aircraft and crew availability. So that way, as conditions are coming up, we can kind of anticipate where to start surveys and really take advantage of those conditions, and start preparing crews and aircraft so that as that weather comes in, we can start those surveys up and optimize our time. So as that's going on as well, the training piece, I'll just kind of speak to this for a couple of slides. So we do annual training workshops pretty much every November, sometimes early December. The training piece is really important for kind of maintaining the survey accuracy. Yeah, it's really kind of, ensuring that that staff have the tools that they need and are communicating amongst themselves in terms of kind of the planning piece on the operational side and actually like the work up in the helicopter itself. And so we conduct training sessions again, kind of this late fall. And yeah, so we're really kind of focused here on, having new observers attend. So getting people familiar with the protocols and what to expect, and getting them in contact with more experienced folks, so there can be some knowledge transfer. More experienced observers, so people that have been doing moose aerial inventories, they attend a minimum of once every 3 years, both for kind of, that just kind of refreshing information, and then also to get them in contact with some of the new folks and try and, again, promote and facilitate that knowledge transfer. And then the survey navigators and survey leads, we have them attend every year that they're involved in a survey. And so there's kind of these different roles. So of course, here we have, a pilot. A survey lead is usually somebody who's kind of focusing on the distribution of aircraft within a survey. And they're oftentimes a navigator. The navigators will be sitting in front with the pilot, and they're the person that'll be kind of directing the aircraft in terms of which plots and flight lines. So they'll be cooperating with the pilot on that front. And also they're usually the most experienced person. And it will be, kind of the person that will be making the final determination on the number of animals, the type of tracks, the direction of tracks, the age and sex of the animals, like all those kind of critical decisions. Yeah, I think in a couple slides from here, kind of talk a little bit more about the observers and kind of how that looks. Also, as part of the training, we rely heavily on these two documents. There's the standards and guidelines for moose population inventory in Ontario, which kind of describes all this information about when and under what conditions we'll do surveys. And I've got another slide kind of passes that goes into this in a bit more detail. And then there's this other document, the Moose Aerial Observation Manual, that gets a little bit more into the operational sense around, how do you physically search for moose? What are the defining characteristics of a cow versus a calf? Like those sorts of really fundamental aspects of how to identify moose when you're actually in the helicopter itself. And so there's really a range of topics that we cover in these workshops. So for observers and navigators, kind of providing that general context, the roles and responsibilities of the various positions, equipment, the plot layout, the searching technique, and kind of this information about, when you're in the helicopter. So safety, visual ID, aging and sexing moose, and then using tracks and body shape to find moose. And then the second set of workshops that we run around navigators and leads, this is kind of, focusing again on those kind of coordinating sort of elements. So how are we delivering as a province, and kind of the connection points between aviation, the crews, the leads, and the regions. Again, roles and responsibilities, and stratification, and some of this higher level planning and data management that is necessary to make sure that the data that we're collecting is being collected correctly, and that is being fed into the database and management correctly. So yeah, so I mean, really that June through November is really all kind of moose aerial inventory planning. There's a lot that leads up to that, and surveying really starts happening pretty much when we have the correct weather conditions. And the regulated hunt has ended. And so that's when we can start surveys, and then they'll usually run through until either moose run into late winter habitat, or there's something about their behavior that's changing where, where they're not following the behavior we need for surveys. So, and this is the rule set around that. So the surveys are conducted during specific conditions. So as I was just kind of stumbling over there, we really have kind of these dates. So in parts of the province, we can start as early as December 1st. Throughout much of the province, it's around December 15th to 17th, depending on when the hunt ends. And usually, it depends which part of the province we're in, but surveys will usually wrap up around February 15th. And again, that has to do with moose behavior. What happens in late winter is that moose will slow down and move under deeper conifer cover where we can't see them. And we don't want to be spending our time counting moose that we can't see, because we're going to bias it low. And so when we see moose moving into that kind of deep conifer cover, all of us start having a conversation about like, okay, when do we need to close that survey down? And I say around February 15th, because this really varies depending on what part of the province we're in. So typically over the course of a year, we actually usually start our surveys farther north, and then the surveys kind of move south and east. And that really tracks quite well with moose behavior in relation to habitat. So, moose kind of in the traditional boreal area will move into late winter habitat earlier than they will kind of farther south. And in parts of the province, say kind of south of Sudbury, kind of the Algonquin area, farther south than that, there's some parts of the province where moose really don't move into late winter habitat, either because of the snow conditions or just the relationship to habitat, and kind of conifer, deciduous, and mixed wood. And so we can survey quite a bit later, kind of the farther south that we go.
Phil, I've got a question here about snow. Can you describe the snow cover amount, or the amount of snow, I should say, like the window, if you will, that allows for surveys to be conducted? So i.e. there's not enough snow, or there is enough snow to cover like rocks and stumps for visibility, but not so much that it would hinder moose movement and therefore their visibility for surveys due to deep snow. So like, is there, what's too much? And
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so it's really what we're trying to do is like think about that behavioral component, just as you're saying, Kirsten, where, if there's not enough snow to cover the rocks and stumps, we're going to be spending our time looking at dark brown things that are not moose, which is not great. And then, as you say, like if the snow gets too deep, moose will just kind of stop moving.
Okay.
And then that's also problematic. What I would say is this also kind of depends a little bit.
Okay.
The sweet spot, I would say, is usually between about 30 centimeters and maybe a little bit over a meter. Like that's probably the ideal. That said, we can go under 30 centimeters. There's parts of the province where 20 is reasonable. And it's not very often that, snow gets too deep for moose. Okay. There are areas where it will happen. And usually what we'll end up seeing is moose will slow down and they'll get labored as they're kind of like avoiding the helicopter.
Right.
And so we can really actually kind of like look at that behavior and then start having these conversations about either reducing the amount of time on a moose, so kind of stepping back and making sure not to stress it.
Yeah.
Or I guess I haven't seen it yet since my time in the industry, but we could have a conversation about just like, kind of wrapping stuff up in that area as well.
Right. Just following up on that, here, at least in Southern Ontario, we've had, until now at least, a relatively snowless, besides the Christmas debacle, winter. So for this year's surveys, did you find it a little bit difficult? So like, was there less snow up there, or was it still okay in Northern Ontario for the most part?
Yeah, this has been a really hit or miss sort of season. Yeah. It hasn't been great. So in an ideal world for moose surveys, what I'd love to see is, a good base of say 30 to 50 centimeters, get 5 centimeters of snow, have a good cold front come in, and then have just like blue skies for 3 straight days, where, it's clear, good flying conditions, not much wind. And that gives us time for moose to set tracks, so we can see the tracks that lead us to the moose. Which helps us, because you're not always seeing moose. Sometimes you're seeing tracks and then the moose.
Yeah.
So that's the ideal. And this year, especially here in kind of southern and central Ontario, it's been, we get all the snow at once and then nothing.
And then it's gone.
Yeah, and it has been better up north, but even talking with the folks on the northern surveys, it's been a difficult year to get good blocks of weather kind of consistently.
So then is the MNRF looking into alternative surveying methods, especially, maybe in the years to come, what with, climate change, less snow overall, potentially as a trend going into the future? is there any thought as to looking into drones or something, that is cheaper than helicopters and something that would be possible to find moose with less snow cover?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We are having conversations on it. It's the short answer. It's interesting. There's no silver bullet that I'm aware of yet. There's been interesting developments though. So just as a way of context, so drones are somewhat new.
Yeah.
It's only been in the past couple of years where they've become more cost effective. In past years, one of the problems with drones is that their flight duration is too short for them to be effective, where they either need to be in line of sight of the operator or you need a special license, which required some challenges with Transport Canada. Those rules have changed, I think, just in the past 2 years, which are opening up more opportunities for the use of drones. That said, the drones have recently been tested in Manitoba, and there does seem to be some positive outlooks in kind of open areas. I think it's still an open question on how effective they will be in kind of conifer-dominated systems. So if you think of a drone, essentially it has one eyeball, whereas a helicopter has 4 eyeballs looking at different angles. And so the angle at what you're looking relative to the flight platform kind of gives you different perspectives. So I think that's one element. Independent of that, but also interesting, is the use of near infrared. So some of the earliest work on near infrared for ungulate surveys, believe it or not, was in the 1970s on white-tailed deer. So it's not a new technology for wildlife, either management or monitoring. And again, there's been some jurisdictions that have used it and had some success. One of the challenges, again, that we have in Ontario is near infrared works great on leaf-off conditions. So open areas and hardwood forests are probably somewhat effective. But again, they're not a silver bullet for conifer cover. So there's a bit of a challenge there.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's those methods. Some of the other conversations we've had a little bit is, trying to think about what other tools are there that are not necessarily aerial in nature. So there's been some work out west in the use of camera traps to look at population change in, say, caribou and predators. And so there's no reason that couldn't apply to moose as well. But it's kind of a matter of scale and implementation. So there's some thoughts about that. Ultimately, what I suspect in kind of looking forward is that as climate change continues and as snow becomes perhaps more dynamic as it has been this winter, is instead of maybe doing a hard shift into a new technology, we may end up having to do thinking about different methods. How can they collectively provide information? So a mixture of moose aerial inventories and cameras.
Right, that makes sense.
And hunter reporting, and using all of that information together to give us a better sense of what's going on. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a question I'm very excited about, for sure. It's one I think is definitely kind of always ticking around in the back of our brains and trying to anticipate how we can kind of take that next step moving forward. I won't belabor too much more on this slide. I guess just the only other aspect here is, as we're kind of alluding to, there's this behavioral element related to snowfall and temperature and wind. And then there's kind of this visibility component too, related to snow depth and speed and altitude. And so the reason that we really focus on trying to keep this as consistent as possible is because if we don't have the right behaviors and the right visibility, that can give us the wrong information. And so it's really important that we, hold fast to flying during the right conditions and not accepting poor conditions, even if that means sometimes, starting a survey and having to cancel it and repeating it in the following year. So I kind of talked about this a little bit a couple of slides earlier. So each crew consists of 4 crew members: the pilot, the navigator, and the 2 observers. One of the things we've had a lot of conversations with here recently as well is, really this knowledge transfer piece. Just as, experienced biologists are retiring and new people are coming up, our staff are kind of stretched thin. It's moose files and forestry files and fish files. There's all these different competing needs. And so what we aim to do is make sure that there's no more than 1 new observer per aircraft, so that way there's that ability to kind of facilitate that knowledge transfer and that discussion with people that have experience observing and can help bring that person along. In terms of flying a plot itself, so our plots are 25 square kilometers, so 10 kilometers long on one side, 2.5 on the other. Crews will fly these predetermined flight lines for consistent availability. So here on the right-hand side, kind of in this example, the top half of this plot is shown in gray. These green vertical lines are the flight lines, and then the dotted red shows, the path of the helicopter that came up this line, circled around, observed 2 bulls at the top of the line, came up around and started down. And so the idea is, hold tight to those lines, but then divert for them. Either check areas that are not visible from the line. So you can see that here with this hill, the helicopter circled around the hill and kind of 2 loops here, just to ensure that the back edge of that slope was covered, and then went back online. And then also to follow tracks and to age and sex moves. So whether you see an animal straight from the plot line, you'll veer off to age and sex it, or sometimes you'll see a fresh set of tracks and then follow those tracks until you see the animal. And then here, as you can kind of see on the notes, once you see that animal, our crews record the individual groups, and then do the aging and sexing within that. And then I guess just the other part, thought I had a cartoon here, but I don't. Each crew member kind of searches their individual area. So if you think of a helicopter, you have a pilot, navigator, to kind of focusing front and a little bit to the sides. And then the observers have side windows, and they're really looking out kind of on the sides and focusing their efforts there. So everybody has a search area or a view area that they're really kind of focusing on while flying the plot.
How far out are they seeing? Like how far out into the horizon, I guess you'd almost call it, depending on how high the helicopter would be?
Yeah. So the lines are 500 meters apart. So if you divide that in half, essentially it's a 250 meter from the helicopter out is the area they're searching on each flight line. Yeah, and then what they'll end up doing is actually adjusting the elevation depending on the conditions and the visibility and what they're doing. If they're trying to find tracks, trying to find moose, or trying to age and sex an animal. So for example, during training, there's this one example slide we have where you're flying along and there's a set of tracks. And so typically, if you have a set of fresh tracks or a couple of animals, the pilot will actually gain more altitude with the idea of kind of getting a broader view and identifying, the animals within that area. And then once those are identified, they'll come back down at lower altitude to age and sex each one of those. So there's really this kind of constant communication between the navigator and the pilot in terms of that elevation and speed to try and maximize that the visibility along that line. So the next couple of photos are pretty typical examples of what you would see from a helicopter. You can actually see here in this photo, you can see just down here, kind of the lip of one of the windows in a helicopter. And so yeah, tracks really play a pretty critical part to moose aerial inventories. So what happens is crews will follow fresh tracks back to animals. And there's really quite a bit of experience that comes with identifying track condition, its age and the species. And it really varies, obviously, depending on the age of the track, but also the light and shadows, so what time of day it is, the wind temperature and habitat. So tracks will get what we call blown out. So they will look less new when there's more wind, warmer temperatures, or a habitat is more open. And then also the shape of the track changes quite dramatically depending on snow depth and then how much snow is, if there's just a skiff of snow over the past, say, 24 hours. So here on the right, this is a pretty good example of the kind of the texture of tracks between newer tracks where it looks, really kind of modeled and what we call sharp. Where you can kind of see like hard shadows and edges. Whereas these old tracks kind of going along this logging road down here are softer. You can kind of see the shadows are a little bit smoother. You can not see quite as much depth. And so as crews are going along, they're really looking for this difference and trying to find tracks or collections of tracks that are newer, and then following those to moose. And so, identifying species, direction, track age from an aircraft really does take quite a bit of practice and experience. So here's another kind of classic photo from a helicopter. You can kind of see a series of tracks here in the bottom right leading up and to the left. And if we trace these just visually, so I mean, these are pretty fresh. You can see kind of deeper snow kicking around, maybe a bit of a belly drag here and here. You can see a moose here at the end of the track coming north. Similarly, there's a moose here about to open up into this block, and kind of the same sort of setup. Over here on the right, this set of tracks, it doesn't go any farther than here. But yeah, so this is a little bit more fresh, whereas these are a little bit older. You can kind of see how they're a bit softer. And so these, again, are kind of the sites that crews are looking for as they're moving along. And so then, yeah, moose are often found by tracks as per that previous slide, and then of course also by movement. Here, it's pretty hard to see these three moose here on the bottom, but once you put this in motion, when the machine is moving and the moose are moving, it obviously becomes a lot easier to see those animals as they're going along. But you can kind of also see, like thinking to that last picture to this one, how the light itself really changes what those tracks look like. Here it's very difficult to see the tracks, whereas in the last one, they were quite easy to pick out. You can kind of see some faint tracks here and off on the right. I mean, the tracks coming from these three animals are mostly blocked by this tree, but you don't see anything particularly obvious, either due to the snow depth or due to the light conditions, just the angle of the sun relative to the helicopter. And so then this is kind of another example. Thinking about the search pattern. So this was the cartoon I thought was on a previous slide. And then a moose. So in this case, looking at the tracks, the shadows, you can't really see any tracks. The shadows are getting really long through the trees. And so most of the tracks are going to be pretty difficult to see. Presumably this is either going to be, a first plot of the day with conditions improving, or maybe the last plot of the day, trying to wrap stuff up before the shadows get too long. But yeah, so there's this bowl with a pretty good spread, it looks. And then here on the search pattern, so just thinking again about, going back to like these view sheds or kind of search areas. So if here, let's say we're the observer on the right side of an aircraft, similar to this, we'll typically be doing is, trying to look out 250 meters in kind of a zigzag pattern, so trying to cover it as we're moving along. And that can either be a pretty rigid sort of triangle shape, or more realistically, what it typically is your eyes are kind of following edges. So where you're more likely to see tracks and dark shapes moving kind of where it's open. And so your eyes might be following kind of the edges of the darker trees where you need to spend a little bit more mental effort, like looking for moose and tracks and just kind of tracing that within the that 250-meter edge.
Can you talk about like how do you prevent seeing moose like twice? They're quite mobile, so how do you make sure that you're not counting them twice or multiple times? They're quite mobile, so yeah.
Yeah, nope, good question. So tracks do have a lot to do with it, and so that's part of the reason why we mark off animals. So if I'm going to just back up a couple of slides, like thinking about this slide here, right? So if we came up this line, saw these two bulls, by the time we came back, for all we know, these two animals could have moved all the way over here.
Exactly, yeah.
And so that's really, in any given plot, the navigator really kind of needs to pay attention to what they're seeing when,
Okay.
and taking a look at those tracks. And so, yeah, if you're seeing animals move between lines, just trying to keep track of that. And so in this case, if these two bulls wandered over here, you would just keep going and you wouldn't divert from it.
Right.
Yeah, and that does get more difficult the more moose there are on a plot. So in a low density plot, it's marking each one off might be pretty straightforward, but if you're getting 20 plus moose that are all moving around, it does become a little bit of an accounting exercise to make sure that you're not double counting or missing. Yep. So once we see the moose, then all those other photos, really kind of like taking that view of the tracks and the animals. So then the next step, once we see them, is then to follow that animal and really just long enough to age it and sex it. This time of year, antlers are not a foregone conclusion. Some bulls will have dropped them, not all will, depending on where we are and what time of year we're flying. Usually what we end up doing is trying to fly in behind the animal and look for the white vulva patch, which is diagnostic for females. So yeah, if you see a white vulva patch, easy, it's a cow. There is a little bit of, not nuance, but it can be tricky in deeper snow sometimes. Animals will be kicking snow up and they'll have snow on their hindquarters. And so it might take a little bit more time. It may not always be obvious, but that's usually what we're looking for. And then there's these secondary characteristics as well. So bulls typically have a larger bell. Again, antlers, maybe not. It will often have a darker face, whereas cows will typically have a smaller bell, a lighter face, and maybe with a calf. But really, we do emphasize in training kind of, focusing on the vulva patch. Because just by chance, calves can be with a bull. We definitely see a lot of variation in face color and bell size. So you can have bulls that are, smaller bells and lighter faces that without really looking, you might mistake for a cow. And then here you can kind of see in this scenario, like the body size difference in shape between a calf and a full-grown cow. Just kind of, a little bit more compact shape and length and height is typically how we identify calves and separate those out from adults.
Just a quick question here. I think we touched on it just briefly a little bit further or a little bit ago, but you're getting a little bit close to these moose, right, in the helicopter. So can you touch on does it add some stress to them? And if so, how much, or is it, do they recover pretty quickly? Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I should say this is photo just the clarity is definitely zoomed in, kind of cropped out and zoomed in. We try not to get too close. You can imagine there's probably no zero stress situation. I always kind of think of it equivalent to if an alien drives over top of me, I'm probably going to get a little twitchy for a bit. Really what we focus on is, again, paying attention to the behavior of the animal, and one, spending as little time on animal as possible. So really trying to get the age and sex characteristics and move on.
Right.
And then if for whatever reason, again, it's labored and it's movement, it's breathing, then we just kind of like put it down as an unknown adult and move on. So really
Okay.
try to limit that stress. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mhm. Yeah, and so I guess this is kind of a good example of some of the angles that you might see from a helicopter, kind of in that first sweep, where again here you're breaking between these two sets of trees. You've got three animals. From this angle, you don't have a good view of the hindquarters. Based off of body shape, it's my first gut reaction would be a cow and two calves behind it. Kind of a bigger animal and two smaller coming up, kind of following the tracks and shorter stature in the snow. But this is one of those cases where there's not confidence in that. You would try and circle around, get a bit of a better angle on the hindquarters just to confirm what your determination is. And really, the other thing here with agent and sexing is, again, the vulva patch is really what we're hoping to kind of key in on, just because of it being diagnostic, but also using as many characteristics as we can, and having a discussion within the crew. Both for that knowledge transfer piece, so that newer observers get familiar with kind of moose biology and observation, so that they're more comfortable moving into a navigator role. And then also just to be sharing kind of information and knowledge about survey conditions, what we're seeing on the ground. And especially here kind of with newer staff, we often encourage is practicing between plots. So as we're faring between two survey plots, like that's an opportunity to talk about tracks and to talk about animals. And if you see animals, like have a conversation about what it is and why you're calling it a cow, a calf, or a bull. So just thinking about kind of finishing the survey, like how good is good enough? Like what are we aiming for? So usually with these sorts of conversations, what I am saying is, in an ideal world, we'd count every single moose on the land. It's just not feasible. Like we'll never get to that point. And so we have these operational targets that we try to focus on. And so, as we talked about earlier, really looking for consistent moose behavior throughout the survey. So again, that idea that we need moose to be visible throughout a survey. So if they're moving into late winter habitat, like that's not great, and we don't want that in the survey. So we're trying to ensure that moose behavior is appropriate during survey. In terms of the population estimate, we're looking to have a moose population estimate plus or minus 20%. And that's pretty consistent with other jurisdictions and their targets from aerial ungulate surveys. And that 20% is the idea that your mean estimate that 80% of the time is going to fall within that bound. Or sorry, I phrased that wrong. But it's within that 20% of that estimate. And then finally, we want to ensure that our age and sex ratio, so that demographic information is correct, or is stable, that what we're seeing is reflective of the population. So I'm just to kind of show that graphically. What we end up doing is we're actually tracking the survey as we're collecting the data. So most nights, the regional contacts or myself will get data from the crews, and we'll look at those data and see what our population estimate looks like, what our confidence is, and then look at how is some demographic parameter changing as our sample size is increasing. So in this case, in this example, we're looking at the mean bull to cow ratio, And what we want is we want this to be a flat line. And so if this is changing rapidly, that means that, we probably haven't sampled the entire population well enough to call a survey good. And so in this scenario for this survey, I wouldn't want to be calling the survey at 35 plots. So once we hit 40 or 50, like, okay, then we're getting pretty good. And out past that, like it's really quite flat. And so that's what referred to as kind of like a stable demographic ratio. And so we have pretty good confidence that we've sampled the moose population representatively. So our data are robust. Kirsten, did you have a question there? I saw you pop up on my screen for a second.
No, that's all right. It's you covered it. All good.
Okay. Okay, and then so as we're kind of wrapping those surveys up, then we kind of move into delivering the results, so estimating the populations themselves. And so this is kind of that final step before we get into the harvest planning. So I'm just going to walk through an example, just a mock example with made up data, just to kind of show you what it looks like. So let's say we have this survey area. It's about 23,000 square kilometers. We flew about 100 plots across 3 strata, and we observed 344 moose. So if that's our survey, what we'd end up doing, and we flew, say, 50 of those 100 plots were in a high density stratum shown here in red, 30 were in a medium density stratum in green, and 20 were in a low density stratum here in yellow and then green. And so from that, we have 214, 89, and 41. So that's our 344 moose. So that's how many we observed. And so that gives us an average number of moose per plot. And that gives us a moose density. And so that's our average density in each one of those strata within a survey area. So then to predict the moose population size in that survey area, we take that density from the previous slide. We multiply it by the plot area, which is that map. So, how many blocks there are that were in the high stratum, medium stratum, low stratum. We multiply that through. That gives us our expected number of moose. And then we add those together. In this case, we get 2,842 moose. So, if we have amalgamated surveys, we might want to take that 2,800 moose, and we for harvest planning need to know, well, how many of those were in this WMU versus this WMU. So in that case, what we do is we take these same stratum densities from the entire survey, but then instead of multiplying it by the area across the entire survey area, we multiply it by the strata in that specific WMU. And then we multiply that through and add it up, and that gives us our expected number of moose within that WMU. And then we can really do that same sort of thing for whichever demographic class we're interested. So if we adjust that last slide, now if we ask the question, all right, well, we know that there's 1,400 moose in this. We want to know how many of those are bulls. We take that same information from the survey and the WMU, and then we add in the percentage of bulls in each one of those strata, and multiply that through and add it, and that gives us our number of bulls. And the reason, just quickly, the reason we have no percent bulls by each one of these strata, there's evidence kind of throughout North America that bulls, cows, and calves will use different habitats and kind of locate themselves in different densities. And so oftentimes we wouldn't expect, that the proportion or percent of bulls would be equal in different density strata. So we separate those out in our multiplication. So we kind of account for how bulls distribute themselves differently than cows. So this is just, kind of that graphic then in kind of word form. So that first step is we just calculate moose density by those high, medium, and low strata. and to the population, we multiply it through. And then for whether we're talking about bulls, cows, or calves, we do that same sort of multiplication, but then just add in that extra multiplication term.
Just a question here. Lots of people are asking about the level of accuracy of these surveys, and it's kind of a two-sided thing. Can you also speak to the level of accuracy when accounting for moose that you're not seeing during the surveys and incorporating that into those equations, for lack of a better word? But yeah, just if you want to touch on level of accuracy, there's just a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, survey accuracy is an interesting thing. There's two different components to it. There's some types of accuracy that we handle through the survey protocols, but there is also inevitably missed moose. So if you go to other jurisdictions, they have some sort of correction factor where they will take the expected number of missed moose, multiply it, and that gives you your total number. Ontario, we actually don't do that. And from a management perspective, it kind of comes out in the wash. And the reason for that is what ultimately matters is not the exact number of moose, but the relationship between the number of moose and like the harvest plan itself. So the harvest plans that we've developed as a province for the past 40 years have been essentially developed based off from the number of moose we've seen, not probably the true number of moose. So that relationship between our policies and our plans and the number of moose seen are consistent across time and space. So it's one of those things where we know we're missing moose,
right?
But the trends themselves are consistent. So we have reason to believe that that we're consistently missing the same number of moose.
Right.
And so our trends should be robust to that. And then also our harvest plan should be robust to that as well.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that's a good question though. It's just an element that we tackle a bit differently than some other jurisdictions. Yeah, and then I believe this is where I'll hand it over to Patrick to kind of talk about moose harvest plan.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and jump into it. So if you can just advance there. Thank you. So I could spend a lot of time talking about our harvest planning process in great detail, but I just have 3 slides here that kind of summarize a number of the key points. And for those folks that were on the call a year ago, the call that focused on the allocation process, I presented similar information. But yeah, I just wanted to run through it very quickly and illustrate, particularly tonight, the importance of the moose aerial inventory data in our harvest planning process. But mention some of the other key pieces or key inputs into the process and how that then translates into tag numbers that hunters will see roughly April 1st. So we conduct harvest planning annually and have historically prepared new plans for every wildlife management unit. And that results, like I mentioned, in tag quotas in that same year for residents. So we're entering into a harvest planning cycle now for 2023. That'll result in resident tag quotas for fall 2023, and for the tourism industry, tag quotas for 2024. That's done to give the tourism industry a bit of advanced notice of what tags they're going to have, and they can then market those tags to their clients ahead of time. And what that means is that if you have a change in a particular wildlife management unit, the residents see either the benefit of that change or the impact of that change in an addition of tags or loss of tags in the same year. Whereas the tourism industry, either their benefit is delayed or their loss of tags is delayed. But Nonetheless, it impacts both the same way. It's just how fast it impacts them. Currently, harvest planning is done based on some guidance we have in a transitional guideline. That's based on a fair bit of science over many years, past harvest guidance, and some recent analysis our science folks have done on the results of past planning efforts. So what impact or influence that has had, or those past efforts have had on populations. And it's transitional right now because we just implemented some pretty significant changes, really a very fundamental change to Ontario's harvest planning approach with calf tag quotas. And so this gives us a bit of time to learn from those results and adjust as necessary before we finalize those guidelines going forward. Those draft harvest plans each year are reviewed by the Big Game Management Advisory Committee, and they make recommendations on potential changes before they're finalized, and then the tag quotas are released. And what we're ultimately seeking to do is to plan our harvest at biologically appropriate levels. So how many moose can we take, and harvest proportions. So what proportion of those animals we can take should be bulls, cows, and calves. We are currently, I mentioned we conduct harvest planning annually and have historically planned for every unit annually. What we're looking to do is move to more stable tag quotas. So this year, for the first time, at least in many years, we're only looking to adjust harvest plans for those units where we're conducting a moose aerial inventory. And that should result in greater stability in the tag quotas between years. The graphic here on the right-hand side just shows kind of the key steps in the process, and we'll dig into a couple portions of this in the next two slides. But just wanted to highlight the red box at the top. That's where I mentioned the harvest level, how many moose we can take. You see the harvest proportions, that's again a biological consideration. There's a division of the planned harvest between residents and the tourism industry that we'll get into a little bit. I won't speak to the allocation for resident hunters of opportunities between gun and bow tonight. And then finally, I do want to touch on tag fill rates because it's usually the factor that in between moose aerial inventories results in some change in quotas. So next slide. So I just wanted to provide an example here, focusing on those key biological elements I mentioned. So how many moose can we harvest from a population, and what proportion of those moose should be bulls, cows, and calves? So the planned percent harvest is essentially is harvest rate or allowable harvest. So how many moose can we take from that population while still achieving our population objectives? So the particular example I provide here is a unit that we're suggesting is above population objectives. So the population is doing quite well, very robust. We can harvest at a much higher rate, given that the population is doing so well relative to what that area can support. So if it's a population of 1,000 animals and we plan it at a 10% harvest, so allowable harvest at 10%, that results in a planned harvest of 100 moose. So we can take 100 moose from that population. Then we divide it between residents in the tourism industry. I know there's a lot of interest in this. If we have time tonight, we can dig into this a bit more. The policy on this going back to the early 80s was 10% of planned harvest to the tourism industry and 90% of planned harvest to residents. So that's the percentages I use for this particular example. It does vary by WMU, so it's specific to each WMU, but we're using 90 and 10 in this case. So what that means is for those 90 moose that can be taken by residents, we're dividing that up then by the harvest proportions. So the old guidelines would suggest that generally the best division of those moose between age and demographics is, or age and gender, sorry, is 50% bulls, 20% cows, and 30% calves. And of course, this is intended to ensure that we're adequately protecting cows while providing a bit more opportunity with bulls and calves. And that results, so those 90 moose for residents, that results in 45 bulls, 18 cows, and 27 calves. And those 10 moose available for the tourism industry, that's divided up into 5 bulls, 2 cows, and 3 calves. So next slide. So this slide, it just looks at the tag fill rate. And I really wanted to show this to help folks on the call appreciate how high tag fill rates, and particularly increasing tag fill rates, influences tag quotas. So we know how many moose we can take from the population. That's, like I said, the allowable harvest. But we know that hunters don't harvest at the same rate for all tag types. And so our fill rate is generated from our hunter reporting information, which is one of the 2 key pieces in addition to the moose aerial inventory estimates that we use in our harvest planning process. And it gives us a proportion of each tag type in each WMU that was used to harvest a moose. Fill rates, of course, do vary from year to year. A lot of factors influence fill rates. Weather is a big one, of course. And so rather than just going with a single year fill rate, we have historically or traditionally used an average, and that takes some of the variability out of those estimates. Still captures the longer term trends, but it takes out that annual variation. We are working on some methods. Our science folks in particular are working on some modeling methods that may allow us to generate more accurate fill rates based on those factors that influence fill rates. But we're not quite there yet. We hope to be there within the next year or 2. What the figure shows, and this is kind of the devil in the details here, is the influence of fill rates on tag numbers. And really, if you focus on the little graph in the top right, where it shows a fill rate. So I have two calculations there. Both are for a planned harvest of 100 moose. So we want to harvest the same number of moose. But in a case where we have a fill rate of 65%, that results, those 100 moose, we can give out 154 tags to harvest that 100 moose. Whereas if our fill rate is much lower, 21%, that results in 476 tags. So much higher number of tags to harvest the same number of moose. And this is a bit of an extreme example, but not too far away from reality in some cases, in that we have, for many of our gun bull tags and increasingly our bow bull tags, our fill rates are 50% or better, whereas our cow fill rates tend to be much lower. Gun cow can be higher than this, but bow cow is quite low. And so you see how the lower fill rates generate a much higher number of tags. And we get a lot of questions from hunters about, why are you trying to kill so many cows? And of course, that's based on the number of cow tags they see. But what's really happening there is we don't want to kill a lot of cows, of course, but the fill rate is quite low. And so we can give out a lot of tags, even though we want a much lower harvest. And the graph at the bottom just shows how when the fill rate, which is the line, so if you look at the orange line that's increasing over time, how it influences tag quota. So the orange bars are the related tag quota in that case. So as that fill rate increases pretty rapidly over time, you see the tag quota declines over time. Whereas if you look at the blue line, which is a much more stable fill rate over time, you maintain those tag quotas in the blue bars. So that was a very quick run through of some of the key aspects of our harvest planning. And again, wanted to emphasize the importance of the moose aerial inventory data in providing that number of moose and number of bulls, cows, and calves in that population that are a key piece of the information we used in harvest planning. And of course, the other key piece of information is the hunter reporting data. But there is a lot more that goes into it, and that's I guess a discussion for another night. That's all again for the harvest planning piece. I know that there was a desire to talk a bit about the points-based allocation process and the results from 2022. So I'll just very quickly comment on that. We are still working on those results. Of course, we don't have the final results until the season ends, because hunters can still claim right to the end of the season currently. And all I can say right now is, based on some early analysis, is patterns do look very similar in year 2 compared to year 1. We did see some fewer applicants in year 2. We are encouraged that it looks like minimum points required is going down more in more units and more tag types than it's going up, which is what we had hoped to see. But we still have concerns about claim rate, and I know it's top of mind for many folks. So that's going to be a real emphasis point of discussion in the next coming year or 2. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Phil, as well. That was a lot of information that was very helpful. We'll move into our Q&A session now, so I'll just turn it over to Mark now. I believe we've got lots of questions coming in.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten, and thanks, gentlemen, for the detailed rundown there. We've had questions come in throughout, the course of both Phil and Patrick's portions of the presentation. So because we're focused on Patrick's slide right now, I'll maybe try to target a couple of questions towards that. There's obviously they're both the MNRF and the OFAH have heard concerns about the difference in trends in moose tag allocations between the tourist industry and residents in given years. So some years in some units we've seen an increase in tourist industry tags and a drop in resident tags, for instance. Can you give us a little bit more insight into some of the information and some of the factors that influence something like that? Why you would see an increase in one and a decrease in the other, or vice versa in a given year?
Sure. And really, the only thing that that might drive kind of a differential change in tag quotas between the tourism industry and residents is a difference in the trends in fill rates. So if the tourism industry fill rate was declining, but the resident fill rate was increasing, that could drive or would drive a decline in the resident tag numbers and an increase, in the tourism industry. Usually it's not very apparent, because again, by averaging over time, you usually don't see a significant change within it, between years. But that, like I said, is the only factor that would drive a differential change. If it was a population change and there was a population decline, both the tourism industry and residents would see a decline in tags.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. Now we both tonight and in previous webinars that you've done with us, Patrick, we've gotten quite a few questions about unlicensed hunting. So the harvest by Indigenous communities that doesn't seem to be accounted for in the slides that you mentioned tonight. How does the MNRF communicate and collaborate with Indigenous communities to talk about moose harvest and try to incorporate that information in whatever way is possible to ensure that overall, moose harvest is sustainable in the province?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a good question, particularly for tonight, the topics that we've covered here, because I guess I'll start by explaining kind of how our system is designed to overcome any lack of information on other mortality sources besides provincially licensed harvest. And it really does hinge on these moose aerial inventories and the repeated moose aerial inventories. So our moose harvest plans, we adjust percent harvest. I mentioned how important that is in the planning process. We adjust percent harvest in response to changes in observed population. So if we conduct a survey in 1 year and then 3 years, we come back and do another survey and the population has declined, that results in an adjustment down in our percent harvest. And we know we have a number of factors that cause moose mortality. So it's not just rights-based harvest, but it's predation, parasites, and other things that cause moose mortality. And all of those can be significant factors. So really, like I said, we rely on that repeated measure of our population to make adjustments. So it allows us to overcome that lack of specific information. But that said, we have sought to work more closely with Indigenous groups and communities to share information on harvest levels. And I often cite the good example of our relationship with the Algonquins of Ontario, and they publish their harvest information, and we have a conversation each year about their harvest and the population and where we should be. And we'd like to get there too with a number of communities across the province. The important thing there is to do that, we would really need information from all communities within a given wildlife management unit to account for that specifically in a moose plan, a harvest plan. So, like I said, we have a system that's designed to overcome that lack of information. But as we work on improving relationships and working better with our Indigenous groups and communities across the province, we can account for it more specifically in harvest planning.
Perfect. No, I appreciate that, and it's good to hear. I think this is probably the last question for you, Patrick, at least a question that is very specific to sort of the process and tag fill rates and things like that. Another question about the tourist industry specifically. You mentioned in your example, at least, and maybe this isn't reflective of the reality provincially, but in your example, the tourist industry was allocated about 10% of the moose harvest in that given WMU. Is there, what kind of consideration goes into deciding that split between folks? And is there anything else? Is 10%, it doesn't sound like 10% of the moose harvest is universal across the province, probably more or less depending on where you are and what unit you're in, but is that reflective of an abundance of animals that is being allocated to the tourist industry, or is it purely a proportion of the existing population?
Actually, it goes back some time. So the original policy to provide 10% to the tourism industry, that was based on a survey of moose hunters back in the early 80s on essentially what proportion of the allowable harvest they were comfortable, essentially sharing with the tourism industry. So that was at the provincial scale. But then for each wildlife management unit, there was a specific proportion that was developed that at that time added up to 10% or equated to 10%. And that was based on for each unit, what the tourism industry, the size of industry and demand for opportunities at the time. So some of those northern units that where at least in the early 80s, access was poor for residents generally, and there was a pretty thriving tourism industry. some of those units might be actually closer to 50% of the allowable harvest goes to the tourism industry. But what we've seen over time and what hunters have probably observed is, at least in some cases, it's kind of shifted, above 10% to the tourism industry at the provincial scale. And that's really because many of the units where there's a heavier tourism industry presence, or a higher proportion of planned harvest goes to the tourism industry, those are the units where our moose population has done better. So they've kind of held on and maintained their opportunity, where core moose range, more accessible moose range, where there's a much higher percentage that goes to the resident hunter, they've done more poorly in recent years. So it's shifted, not intentionally, but just because really reflective of populations and where populations have done well compared to where they have done poorly.
Perfect. Thanks for that. I lied. Actually, there's one last question for you, I believe, Patrick. And this is maybe a somewhat nebulous question, but you touched on it at a couple different points in the presentation, talking about a review of the new process and all of the elements that would be examined in that regard. But Jim has a question about whether or not there is a plan in place to address the concerns about unclaimed tags or surplus tags. I guess there's can't really call them surplus anymore, but the unclaimed tags. And how is that conversation going to be set up? How are hunters going to be engaged? And is there any plan internally within the ministry to really engage folks on that in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, in some ways it's a difficult question to answer. One thing I will say for sure is the unclaimed tags is kind of the primary concern we see with the new allocation process. I think for the most part it's functioning as we had expected. But yeah, we have some concerns, and they definitely aren't surplus tags in that they're tags that hunters want in some cases, high demand tags. When the Big Game Management Advisory Committee made their recommendations, that included a recommendation to review the process after 3 years. I would say we're probably still on that timeline, but we've already started having discussions about, what can we do to address that concern specifically. It is one that's probably not easy to solve. But depending on what sort of options we may be able to come up with to try to address it, I think that'll have an influence on how hunters are engaged. Like if it's a significant change in the process, we're definitely going to be consulting with hunters. If we can't come up with any sort of significant change and it's a much smaller change, it may not include any sort of major engagement or consultation. It just depends on the scale of the change, typically.
Well, it's great. It's great to hear, Patrick. I appreciate that. And I know that that's a question that we often hear from hunters, both, as you mentioned, Big Mac had recommended it. The OFAH has had recommended it as well. We certainly got some signals from the ministry in the past that that was a review that they were certainly willing to consider looking into. And given some of the concerns that hunters have, it's certainly something that there's a value in engaging people in if there's, as you say, enough meat on the bones there to actually warrant consulting folks widely. So appreciate that, and we look forward to those discussions in the future. I'll let you out of the hot seat, Patrick, and I'll turn it back over to Phil here and talk about some of the earlier questions that we got related to the specifics about moose aerial inventories. So Phil, going all the way back to the beginning of your presentation there, there was, I assume this was in relation to one of the maps that you showed about, the timing and the cycle of moose aerial inventories in the province and the difference between core and far north areas. So Claude has a question about, why are targeted surveys occurring less frequently in Northern Ontario than in some of the more southern parts?
Yeah, no, good question. That really comes down to kind of the overarching survey policy. This line, kind of between the blue and the green, it represents kind of that rough boundary there between surveyed ecological zone A and surveyed ecological zone B. It's not exactly perfect on some of these units. But yeah, so surveyed ecological zone A, the expectation or the overall guidance around moose is that there's somewhat low density, as kind of expected by those landscapes. Whereas surveyed ecological zones B, C, the Ds are targeting kind of that moderate to high density. And so that's part of it. The other is in terms of the pressures to the populations kind of along that northern boundary tend to be a little bit lower as well. That's not ubiquitous across that entire swath. It kind of goes without saying, I'm sure many of you know, like the pressure, say, to the 16 is different than the 25. But those are kind of two of the major factors that are driving kind of that split.
Perfect. Thanks, Phil. Hopefully that answered Chloe's question. Another question, actually, two or three questions, I think, we're focusing on the financials, the aspects of, funding. Yeah, I hear you. So I guess a relatively safe question is, how much is allocated or budgeted every year for all of the moose aerial inventories in the province, roughly? And maybe a slightly more sensitive question is whether or not, you guys are being provided enough money to sufficiently monitor enough moose populations at the level that is required to ensure that provincially our moose populations are sustainable.
Yeah, no, those are good. I'm not sure I can answer the question about the actual dollar value. It changes, and it's surprisingly difficult to actually nail down because it kind of depends on how you want to cut it. If you want to just talk about aviation time, if you want to talk about staff time and salary, like all those different pieces, like depending which numbers you pull into that, the value looks very, very different. In terms of resourcing and what is adequate, there's what I would say is there's the things that make successes and failures in terms of being able to deliver surveys come from a couple of things. Certainly money is always a part of it. Another part is obviously weather and kind of changing weather patterns and where those are. And then also kind of the availability of helicopters, which I never thought would be a problem in the past. But yeah, so even reaching out, you can imagine, so we're looking for 15 helicopters at points in time this winter. And thinking about the number of helicopters that we have in the ministry, and then competing against industry for other helicopters in the marketplace is not easy. Typically, we're competing against companies that provide contractors like aviation contractors with stable money so far that they have a job and they don't depend on weather, and ungulate surveys do depend on weather. So when we're looking for a commercial operator, there has to be some amount of flexibility for them to respond to our needs within, say, 24 hours in different parts of the province. And so there's actually a lot of different moving pieces in terms of having sufficient resources. So it's interesting, but more money is not always the solution to getting it done. At some points in time, it can be restrictive, and especially we have seen costs of doing surveys increase. As many of you I'm sure are aware, gas prices increased this past year. That's trickled down to the aviation industry. There's a shortage of pilots throughout much of Canada with helicopters, and so that's impacting some of our business as well. And not just moose aerial inventories. helicopters, but like just helicopter business. And so all of those do kind of, create these pressures and these ongoing conversations. What I will say, kind of like looking out, in terms of funding that we're requesting and have been receiving, as part of that survey plan, every time that we pull a plan together, I forecast it out for 10 years to look to see if we can achieve that 3 to 5 year sort of cycle. And even with these past 2 COVID years where, we weren't able to get as much work done as we'd necessarily hoped, as long as the weather cooperates, we're on schedule to meet our 3 and 5 year targets within about another 3-ish years, and just kind of keep coming back to that. So I would say to date, funding hasn't been an issue. It's really been kind of recently the helicopters and mostly just the weather.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that. Kirby has a question about the scale at which moose aerial inventories are flown. We're looking at a map here of wildlife management units. Back in the day, certainly a survey would have been flown at the wildlife management unit scale. My understanding is that that might not be the case anymore. Is there are some of these wildlife management units, some of these surveys sort of amalgamated in a given effort to increase efficiency? Or
Yes, yep. So the province has been doing amalgamated surveys in the south for quite some time. So like the 60s, the 50s, some of the lower 40s, and then like 7A and 7B. So I mean that started, oh goodness, I don't know, quite some time ago. And then in recent years, kind of took a step back in looking at the information that as a province we need to deliver and how best to deliver it consistently over time. So that way, we're reducing uncertainty in population estimates over big time and big space. And then also, as Patrick was saying, around looking at getting the time for management. So getting those surveys in order. Instead of surveying at the individual WMU level, we've kind of taken that amalgamated sort of approach and expanded it across a larger part of Ontario. And that's part of the reason why, it's looking much more favorable to hit these 3 to 5 year targets. And so that was certainly a strategic decision. Again, to kind of circle back, that 3 year target has been on the ministry's to-do list since the 80s. And looking back through the 90s and early 2000s, like it's a target that we've always struggled to hit. And it's created some management pinch points. And so being able to provide the same the population estimates at the WMU level, but conducting the survey kind of at a broader spatial scale, allows us to reduce uncertainty in time. So that's kind of the trade-off. And in terms of like what those amalgamations look like, or survey areas is kind of the shorthand I've been using for them. What we're doing is we're kind of following some of the other existing sorts of existing policy, like the survey ecological framework, and some other work that has been done. So trying to take, or not trying, just taking WMUs that have similar ecological conditions. So that way, it's more likely that moose are having the similar sorts of behaviors. So you can kind of see, if we look kind of in the northwestern corner for 6, 7B and 7A, as an example, kind of in that northwest, those are grouped together, and those populations have really been doing pretty much the same thing if we look over the past 20 to 30 years of moose population data. Similarly, kind of if we move to the east, kind of some of those population changes over time, at least at broad scales in terms of productivity and trends, there's some consistency. So we're really trying to focus on amalgamating kind of to that level that's ecologically sensible for moose biology and for management.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really insightful response. I guess the concern that we often hear from hunters is, if you're sampling multiple wildlife management units at the same time, and then you're deriving a wildlife management unit population estimate from which you're deriving tag fill or not tag fill rates, but tag allocations for moose hunters, the population estimate for that particular WMU might actually be influenced by the number of moose you saw in a particular stratum in another unit, in a neighboring unit.
Mm,
And how do you reconcile those two things? If you
yeah,
sample units 35 and 38 together and you generate an estimate for 35 alone to generate tag allocations for hunters, the
yeah.
population estimate for 35 is built somewhat on what you saw in 38. And how would you
So,
reconcile those two things?
yeah, no, that's a really good question, and the answer is there is somewhat. Where that's accounted for is actually in the stratification. Trying to think if I have. I'm actually going to go down to the population estimate. I think this might portray it a little bit better. I'm sorry for flipping through these all so quick. Right, so this made up data here. These are two WMUs, WMU 23 and 30, just outside of kind of the Timmins to Cap sort of axis. And so if we were flying, if we weren't stratifying, we were treating all moose the same, that could be problematic because just by chance you could have all the moose on in one WMU and not the other. But the fact that we're doing this stratification, what you can see is that in this example, WMU 30 has more high density plots than WMU 23. And so although the densities are being estimated across to the entire, both of these units together, because they're being multiplied through by the observed densities or historical densities in the strata. So what this is doing is it's saying, yeah, excuse me, yes, we're estimating the average density of moose in the high stratum across everything. But there's more high density plots in WMU 30. And so as a result, we're going to end up with more moose there than we would in WMU 23. And this is robust because it's actually pulling from the historical data. We're not placing our assumptions on it. We're actually letting the moose tell us where they are. And then we're using that to essentially distribute moose across our survey area into those WMUs. So that's kind of, you know, the design method, I guess, by which we kind of account for that, yeah, that challenge.
Okay, perfect. That's an interesting, potentially difficult to grasp concept, but I do appreciate the detail in that answer. Larry has a question about he noticed how readily visible some of the moose were in the photos that you showed in your deck here.
Yeah.
He says, I'm guessing that wolves are easily seen as well at the same time. So do observers keep a rough estimate of the number of wolves and or any other species that they see while they're conducting moose aerial inventories?
We do. Moose aerial, wolf aerial inventories have mixed success across North America. The only area where I'm aware that it's been done consistently and successfully is, kind of an untreed Arctic and subarctic sort of landscapes. So we've had some conversations about the utility of, like wolf counts from these aerial inventories, and I don't think we're there yet in terms of being able to monitor wolf populations consistently. We don't really see a whole lot during new surveys. You can imagine, you just thinking about like, the pyramid where we have the most plants, then the most herbivores, and then the most carnivores. So by definition, pretty much, we're always going to see less predators than we are prey, just because there can't be as many. And so we're always going to have a lot of zeros. What we have done though is, in a standard plot, we collect information on elk, deer, caribou, and wolves, and we track that in our database. Yeah, and so far, and this is partially because of the stratification approach. Like, we're not doing a multiple species survey. Like, our moose aerial inventories are really focused on moose. And when we do, we've done elk surveys, say in the Bancroft area, and kind of off and on. And so those are specifically targeted, stratified for elk, just because like the distribution of those two species is so different that how we would pick plots, that information wouldn't provide robust information for both species. Oh.
Perfect. Thanks for that. I know, sticking with the observations of not just moose but other things while in the air, do observers keep track, or can they even really notice really severe tick infestations on moose? And do they keep track of things like that in the air?
Yeah, so I don't have a good picture of that. But yeah, so there are aerial tick surveys are a thing, where you have essentially a class of like 1, 2, or 3, depending on the severity of hair loss. For better or worse, the timing of moose aerial inventories is not typically the best time of year for winter tick surveys. Throughout much of the Great Lakes and kind of Quebec, the timing where infestation is the worst, it tends to be in later winter. And so those surveys would typically happen kind of more the March or April time period would be kind of the optimal time frame. And so, when we're collecting moose information and noting ticks, the ones that we would see would be probably only the ones that are really bad off later in the year, because if they're showing that much hair loss, in January, that's a really bad sign come March. And if we're seeing moose that have a really good coat and not seeing much tick action, they could still have, kind of a class 1 tick later in the winter, and we just wouldn't know it.
Okay, perfect. I have a question here about far north moose surveys. I mean, we talked about the logistics about caching fuel in these really remote areas.
Yeah.
We have far north units, really sort of inaccessible units that still support regulated moose hunt as well as indigenous harvest. How do some of those really far north and really large wildlife management units like 1A through 1D, how do they factor into the planning for a survey? How do they get prioritized relative to everything else? And are the logistics for flying a survey up in that area dramatically different than they are, let's say, around Sault Ste. Marie?
Yes. Yeah. It is such a different landscape on so many levels. Logistically, ecologically, moose density, all of it. So by way of, to summarize kind of how our past performance in terms of prioritizing, I think we've flown 1A once in around 1984, 1D I think twice, the most recent one I'm always getting this wrong, I think 2008. And I'd have to check with 1C. So we don't get there very often. And prioritizing those has been challenging. In the old system, whereas, both years between and kind of hunter pressure, they didn't come to the top of the list very much. Because although they obviously do have harvest, it's not very intense, and relative to the population size, the total harvest tends to be quite low, as I understand. We have had conversations, is kind of this talking about 3 and 5 year cycles about how does the far north fit into that. And it's a conversation that I'd say we haven't landed yet. And obviously, you know, with like the Ring of Fire and other interests in the north, there's probably discussions that are definitely worth continuing. In the past, in terms of how we've prioritized it's really been kind of on a project level basis. So instead of, you know, being part of a cyclical goal, it's kind of as a specific need comes up, that those come to the top of the list. And that kind of explains why it's been, you know, fairly sporadic. In terms of logistics, yeah, it's pretty intense. There's not a whole lot of areas to fly out of. And really, for those, we do a transect-based survey using fixed-wing aircraft. It pretty much have to, just given the flight times and the density of moose. It's just much more cost efficient. Yeah, and just more feasible. I should say as well, there's been conversations, you know, there's caribou monitoring kind of that happened there kind of leading up to 2014. And that had some moose data associated with it. And there's been some conversations around, you know, is there a future of ungulate monitoring in the north that kind of takes a more of a broad view and considers both moose and caribou in concert? But yeah, there's some technical questions around that and what a design for that might look like as well.
Perfect. Thanks for that. I imagine it's yeah, entirely different conducting a survey up in that neck of the woods than anywhere in core moose range. Sticking with sort of the survey guidelines, you know, you mentioned generating a population estimate and the discussions that occur as the crew is getting closer and closer to sort of a stable bull to cow ratio and generating a population estimate plus or minus 20%. That could be, you know, kind of a wide-ish range. How do you determine, maybe this is a question for Patrick, but how do you determine which number to use when setting annual tag allocations? If it's 100 moose plus or minus 20%, one number is used to determine the tag allocation for that year.
I think I can tackle this.
Sure, yeah.
Patrick.
Yeah.
So yeah, we take the mean estimate. So the predicted estimate that you see, that's the one we use. There's some fancy statistical reasons for that. Essentially, perhaps the easiest way to think about it is that mean is the thing that we have the most evidence for. That's the strongest data or the strongest relationship we have. And as you move farther away from that, either up or down, that's where that percentage comes in. So, you know, if we said 10%, the width would be this. If we said 20%, it would be this. If we said 30%, it would be this. And so, yeah, so that center line mean estimate that we use for management is the best information we have. And so we use that.
Okay, perfect. And I think this is probably the final question that we have that is directly related to the scope of the discussion tonight. A lot of good questions here tonight. Some of these we will try to answer in a follow-up to the webinar. We'll email folks directly with some of these responses. But last question of the night is from Dave, and he's wondering how you know, the moose aerial inventory results are validated, or if they're even validated, comparing, you know, prior years, comparing to what hunters see on the landscape, harvest rates and things like that. We have maybe not nearly as much information and different sources as we would like. As scientists, we always want more data and better data, but we do have some data that we can compare. So are the moose aerial inventory results validated in any way with the other sources of information that we have available to us?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word validated. What I would say is that all the information is kind of taken in together during the harvest planning sort of conversations. And so I guess the reason I would phrase it that way is all of the information that we have is imperfect to get to, you know, your point, Mark, around, you know, we always want more data. And so whether we're talking about moose aerial inventories where it's, plus or minus 20%, or if we're talking about, past surveys or tag moose seen per 100 day, like there's always going to be some amount of uncertainty with that. So for example, just to, I guess, paint a bit of a picture, with moose seen per 100 day, it depends where the hunter is on the land. So is the distribution of hunters random with respect to the moose, or have they covered the representation of the entire WMU? And so there's kind of those considerations. At the end of the day, it always pains me a little bit to have to say this, but like, we don't know truth. Like, we have not counted every single moose. And so whether we're talking about moose aerial inventories or moose seen per 100 data or other information, what we have is some estimate of what we're seeing. And so when we can take that information together and kind of think about the strengths and weaknesses of those data and look to see how they complement one another, I think that those data in combination tend to be where we get our best information from. And that's part of the reason where, like with the harvest planning, there's kind of these different components where there's the moose aerial inventory, there's the tag fill rates, there's all that sort of stuff, and like pulling all that information in together. Yeah, I'm doing it that way.
Perfect. Thank you, Phil. Thanks, Mark, for handling all the questions that came in tonight. We had a great discussion. Thank you to Patrick and Phil again for putting all this together and presenting to us. Very insightful evening for sure. And lastly, thank you to our viewers out there who joined and participated in tonight's event. We hope there were some valuable takeaways for you here.